Have you ever felt drained after helping someone, only to realize they never actually wanted your help? Carl Jung spent decades documenting a terrifying pattern. Certain people make specific demands that aren't requests at all. They're psychological traps designed to pull you into their unintegrated darkness. Jung called these individuals emotionally dangerous, not because of what they do, but because of what they unconsciously demand from everyone around them. Today, I'm revealing the 5 demands Jung identified as red flags for psychological predators. Because once you recognize these patterns, you'll never fall into their traps again. Jung discovered something disturbing while treating patients in his Zurich clinic. Certain individuals consistently made identical demands across all their relationships. These weren't random requests. They were systematic attempts to avoid confronting their own shadow by forcing others to carry their rejected psychological content. The people making these demands seemed normal, even charming, but Jung noticed they left destruction in their wake. Relationships collapsed, families fractured, careers imploded, and the demanding person always maintained complete innocence, convinced they were the victim of cruel fate rather than architects of their own chaos. But here's what made Jung's blood run cold. These individuals weren't consciously manipulative. They genuinely believed their demands were reasonable. Their unconscious minds had created elaborate justification systems that made their psychological exploitation feel like normal human interaction. This is why they're so dangerous. You can't reason with someone who doesn't know they're weaponizing their unintegrated shadow against everyone who gets close to them. Jung identified the first dangerous demand through his work with patients who destroyed every relationship they entered. These individuals demanded absolute agreement on everything, not just important issues, but trivial matters, personal preferences, subjective experiences. If you disagreed with them about anything, you weren't just wrong. You were evil. You were the enemy. You were attacking them personally. This demand reveals what Jung called shadow projection at its most extreme. The person cannot tolerate any reflection that contradicts their view of reality because their ego structure is so fragile that contradiction feels like psychological annihilation. They've constructed an entire identity around being right, being good, being the one who sees truth clearly. Any disagreement threatens this inflated self-image, triggering massive defensive responses completely disproportionate to the actual situation. Jung observed these individuals in his practice. A patient would describe their spouse, their co-workers, their family members as all conspiring against them, all refusing to see obvious truths, all gaslighting them about reality. But when Jung investigated, he discovered the opposite. These people had surrounded themselves with reasonable individuals who simply refused to pretend the patient's distorted perceptions were accurate. The demand for absolute agreement is really a demand that you abandon your own perception of reality and adopt theirs completely. They need you to see the world exactly as they do, because your independent perspective threatens their psychological defenses. If you maintain your own viewpoint, you become a mirror reflecting back the very qualities they've denied in themselves, and rather than integrate that reflection, they attack the mirror. Modern neuroscience explains why this demand is so dangerous. When someone demands absolute agreement with pathological intensity, they're not engaging in normal discourse. Their amygdala hijacks rational processing, flooding their system with threat responses that make them perceive disagreement as existential danger. You cannot have a relationship with someone whose nervous system treats your independent thoughts as attacks requiring immediate defense. Jung warned that people making this demand will systematically isolate you from anyone who might offer alternative perspectives. They'll poison your other relationships through subtle comments and concerned observations about how those people don't really understand you, don't have your best interests at heart, are threatened by your growth. This isolation serves their need for absolute agreement by eliminating any voices that might contradict their reality distortion field. The second dangerous demand Jung identified was complete self-sacrifice. These individuals expect you to abandon your own needs, dreams, boundaries, and identity to serve theirs. They frame this demand as love, as partnership, as what real friends do for each other. But Jung recognized it as projection of what he called the unlived life. These people cannot tolerate that you have a separate, authentic existence because it reminds them of everything they've sacrificed in themselves. They've abandoned their own dreams, suppressed their own needs, ignored their own boundaries in service of some external expectation. Now they unconsciously demand you do the same, not out of malice, but because your authentic living triggers unbearable awareness of their own self-betrayal. Jung documented case after case where individuals demanded their partners give up careers, friendships, hobbies, even personality traits that the demanding person found threatening. The justifications always sounded reasonable on the surface. We need you home more for the family. That friend is a bad influence. That hobby takes time away from us. But underneath every justification was the same psychological dynamic. Your separate existence, your authentic self-expression, your boundaries that protect your individuality, all serve as painful reminders of what the demanding person cannot access in themselves. This demand often appears gradually, starting with small requests that seem loving and reasonable. Can you skip this event to spend time with me? Can you check in more frequently so I don't worry? Can you dress differently because your style makes me uncomfortable? Each individual request seems minor, but collectively, they're dismantling your psychological autonomy piece by piece. Jung called this the helper's high turned pathological. Some people become addicted to being needed, but not in a healthy, interdependent way. They need you to need them so desperately that you sacrifice your selfhood. Your dependence becomes their identity. Your lack of boundaries becomes their sense of power. Your self-erasure becomes proof of your love. The tragedy Jung observed is that people making this demand truly believe they're asking for normal relationship reciprocity. They cannot see that healthy relationships involve two whole people choosing connection, not one person consuming another's identity to fill the void where their own authentic self should be. They genuinely think your resistance to complete self-sacrifice means you don't really care about them, when actually your boundaries are the only thing preventing total psychological enmeshment. Modern attachment theory validates Jung's observations. People with certain insecure attachment patterns unconsciously demand fusion rather than connection. They cannot tolerate the separateness required for healthy relationships because separation triggers primal abandonment terror. So they demand you merge with them completely, sacrificing your distinct self to soothe their attachment wounds. You become responsible for regulating emotions they never learned to manage themselves. Jung's third dangerous demand involved constant validation and praise. These individuals need continuous affirmation of their perfection, their specialness, their superiority. Any minor criticism, any failure to enthusiastically celebrate their achievements, any moment where attention shifts away from them triggers massive emotional reactions. This demand reveals what Jung called ego inflation. The person has identified with an idealized self-image, constructing an elaborate persona of perfection that bears no relationship to their actual integrated self. This inflated ego is incredibly fragile because it's built entirely on external validation rather than authentic self-knowledge. Without constant praise reinforcing the fantasy, the whole structure threatens to collapse, exposing the denied shadow underneath. Jung observed these patients carefully. They seemed confident, even charismatic, projecting an image of having their lives completely together. But beneath the polished exterior lived crushing insecurity and self-loathing they couldn't consciously acknowledge. So they demanded others constantly reflect back the idealized image, using external validation as psychological armor against their own rejected qualities. The demand for constant praise reveals itself through disproportionate reactions to minor feedback. You offer a gentle suggestion for improvement, and they experience it as devastating criticism. You fail to immediately celebrate their achievement, and they accuse you of jealousy or sabotage. You have needs of your own requiring attention, and they frame it as abandonment or betrayal. These individuals cannot tolerate that you see them as fully human, complete with flaws, limitations, and areas needing growth. They need you to see only the idealized persona, to play along with the fantasy of their perfection. Your honest perception becomes a threat, requiring immediate neutralization through anger, withdrawal, or manipulation, designed to make you doubt your own observations. Jung documented how ego inflation creates impossible relationship dynamics. The inflated person requires you to sacrifice your authentic perceptions to maintain their delusion. You become responsible for managing their fragile self-esteem, carefully avoiding any truth that might puncture their inflated self-image. This turns you into an emotional hostage, constantly monitoring your words and actions to prevent their collapse. What makes this demand particularly insidious is that people making it often occupy positions of apparent authority or achievement. They may have genuine accomplishments, real talents, legitimate expertise in certain areas, but they've become so identified with these achievements that they cannot tolerate being seen as anything less than perfect across all domains. Their identity depends on your unwavering admiration. Modern research on narcissistic personality patterns confirms Jung's observations. People with fragile, inflated self-concepts genuinely experience minor criticism as psychologically catastrophic. Their nervous systems haven't developed the capacity to integrate feedback without perceiving it as complete rejection of their worth, so they demand you sacrifice honest interaction to maintain their defensive structure. Jung's fourth dangerous demand was control over your other relationships. These individuals need to isolate you, cutting you off from friends, family, colleagues, anyone who might offer alternative perspectives or emotional support. They frame this demand through seeming concern. Those people don't really care about you like I do. That friend is toxic. Your family doesn't understand you. This demand reveals what Jung called collective possession. The person needs to create a closed psychological system where they control the flow of information and interpretation. By isolating you from other relationships, they eliminate reality checks that might expose their distorted perceptions. Your isolation becomes their insurance policy against you, recognizing the dysfunction. Jung observed this pattern in family systems, religious communities, and romantic relationships. The demanding individual systematically poisons your other connections through subtle manipulations. They create conflicts between you and others through lies or distortions. They schedule competing activities during important events with your loved ones. They express hurt or anger when you choose time with others over time with them. They frame your other relationships as threats to your bond rather than healthy aspects of a full life. This isolation serves multiple unconscious purposes. It makes you dependent on the demanding person for all emotional needs, giving them tremendous power over your psychological state. It removes witnesses who might notice warning signs of abuse or manipulation. It eliminates support systems you'd need to leave the relationship. And it ensures that only one narrative exists, the demanding person's version of reality, with no competing perspectives available. Jung called this recruitment behavior, and he identified it as one of the most dangerous psychological patterns in human relationships. The isolated person gradually loses confidence in their own perceptions because there's no external validation, only the demanding person's contradictory version of events. This systematic dismantling of someone's reality testing capacity is how psychological abuse gains its most powerful foothold. Modern research on coercive control validates everything Jung observed. Isolation is the foundation that makes all other forms of psychological manipulation possible. Once someone is cut off from external support and alternative perspectives, They become vulnerable to increasingly distorted versions of reality because they have no benchmarks for comparison. The demanding person's narrative becomes the only narrative, true by default rather than actual accuracy. Jung emphasized that healthy relationships encourage connection with others, not isolation from them. Secure individuals celebrate your other bonds because they understand that multiple healthy relationships make you stronger, not weaker. They trust that connection with others enriches rather than threatens your bond. The demand for isolation reveals profound insecurity and controlling patterns that will only escalate over time. The fifth and final dangerous demand Jung identified was that you never change. These individuals need you frozen in whatever role serves their psychological script. If you grow, heal, develop new perspectives, or set healthier boundaries, they experience it as betrayal rather than natural human development. This demand reveals what Jung called repetition compulsion. These people are unconsciously recreating unresolved psychological patterns from their past. They've assigned you a role in their internal drama, usually the role of abandoner, betrayer, or villain. Your actual behavior matters far less than the predetermined script they're unconsciously following. When you refuse to play the assigned role through personal growth or boundary setting, they escalate pressure to force you back into the familiar pattern. Jung documented this pattern extensively. A patient would describe relationship after relationship, following identical trajectories. Different partners, but the same painful ending, always with the patient as innocent victim of cruel betrayal. Jung realized these individuals weren't victims of terrible luck. They were unconsciously selecting partners who fit their unresolved trauma patterns, then orchestrating situations that recreated the original wound. The demand that you never change reveals their need for you to remain the character in their repetitive psychological drama. Your growth threatens the script. Your healing means you no longer fit the role. Your boundaries prevent you from participating in the pattern they're compulsively recreating, so they demand you stay exactly as you were, frozen in the dysfunction that felt familiar to their unintegrated psyche. This demand often appears when you begin therapy, start setting boundaries, or develop healthier relationship patterns. The demanding person experiences your growth as abandonment or attack. They may say you've changed, you're not the person they fell in love with, you're becoming cold or distant or selfish. But what they really mean is that you're no longer willing to play your assigned role in their unconscious drama. Jung observed that people making this demand genuinely cannot see their own contribution to relationship dysfunction. They've externalized all responsibility onto others, convinced that if people would just stay the same or meet their needs correctly, everything would be fine. Your refusal to remain frozen in their preferred version of you triggers massive resistance, because it forces them to confront their own need for change. Modern trauma psychology explains why this demand is so powerful. People trapped in repetition compulsions are unconsciously trying to master original traumatic experiences by recreating them with different players. But because the pattern is unconscious, they can't recognize they're orchestrating the very outcomes they consciously want to avoid. They genuinely believe external circumstances keep victimizing them, rather than seeing how their own unprocessed trauma keeps attracting and creating familiar painful patterns. Jung warned that breaking free from someone demanding you never change requires accepting they may never understand or support your growth. These individuals cannot celebrate your healing because your healing exposes their stagnation. Your boundary setting reveals their lack of boundaries. Your emotional regulation highlights their dysregulation. You become a mirror reflecting everything they refuse to integrate about themselves. Now that you understand these 5 dangerous demands, you need to know how to protect yourself, because recognizing the pattern is only the first step. Jung developed what he called the integration protocol for dealing with people making these demands. Step 1 is conscious discrimination. Learn to identify what belongs to you and what belongs to them. When someone demands absolute agreement, recognize that your differing perception isn't wrong. It's simply different. When someone demands total self-sacrifice, remember that maintaining your boundaries isn't selfish. It's psychologically necessary. When someone demands constant validation, understand that honest feedback isn't cruelty, it's authentic relationship. When someone demands isolation, recognize that healthy connections strengthen rather than threaten bonds. When someone demands you never change, know that growth is natural human development, not betrayal. Step 2 is strategic withdrawal. Jung was clear about this. Some people are so unconscious of their shadow projections that attempting relationship with them will only damage you. If someone consistently makes these demands despite your clear boundaries, you must protect yourself through distance. This isn't cruelty, it's psychological self-preservation. You cannot force someone to integrate their shadow. You can only refuse to carry it for them. Step 3 is wielding your perception. Use your ability to see these patterns not to fix the demanding person, but to build a life where such individuals cannot access you. Become skilled at recognizing red flags early, before you've invested significant time or emotion. Trust your gut when someone's demands feel off, even if you can't articulate exactly why. Your unconscious pattern recognition is protecting you. Jung's ultimate insight was that these demanding individuals aren't evil. They're unconscious. They genuinely don't recognize how their unintegrated shadows create the demands that destroy their relationships. But their unconsciousness doesn't obligate your participation in their dysfunction. You can have compassion for their suffering while maintaining firm boundaries against their demands. The most beautiful part of Jung's work on this topic is his recognition that seeing these patterns clearly is itself a form of psychological development. Most people unconsciously comply with unreasonable demands because they haven't done the shadow work necessary to recognize projection. Your ability to identify these 5 demands means you've achieved a level of consciousness that protects you from manipulation most people can't even see happening. Remember that people making these demands will often escalate when you first set boundaries. They're unconsciously testing whether you'll return to your previous role in their psychological drama. This escalation isn't a sign that you should give in. It's confirmation that your boundaries are working, forcing them to confront the reality that you will no longer carry their unintegrated shadow content. Jung believed that the most dangerous people aren't the obviously toxic ones. They're the ones who seem normal, even appealing, right up until you encounter their unconscious demands. These demands reveal the shadow content they cannot acknowledge in themselves. By projecting it onto you through impossible expectations, they attempt to avoid the painful but necessary work of integration. Your job isn't to save them from their unconsciousness. Your job is to remain conscious of what's yours and what's theirs, to maintain boundaries that protect your psychological integrity, and to build relationships with people who have done enough shadow work that they don't need to consciously exploit others to avoid their own darkness. The 5 demands Jung identified aren't just relationship problems. They're diagnostic tools revealing someone's level of psychological development. People making these demands are showing you exactly where their integration process has stalled. Absolute agreement demands reveal shadow projection. Self-sacrifice demands reveal unlived life projection. Validation demands reveal ego inflation. Isolation demands reveal control needs. Unchanging demands reveal repetition compulsion. Each demand is a window into specific unintegrated shadow content. When you can recognize these patterns clearly, you develop what Jung called psychological immunity. You can interact with unconscious people without becoming infected by their projections. You can maintain compassion for their suffering without sacrificing yourself to their demands. You can see the tragedy of their situation without taking responsibility for fixing it. Jung's final message about these dangerous demands is one of hope. Every person you encounter making these demands is an opportunity to strengthen your own shadow integration. By refusing to comply with unreasonable expectations, you reinforce your own boundaries. By maintaining your separate reality in the face of someone demanding agreement, you strengthen your psychological autonomy. By celebrating your own growth despite someone demanding you stay the same, you claim your right to continual development. The people making these demands are unconscious, but you don't have to be. You can see clearly, set boundaries firmly, and build a life where psychological predators recognize intuitively that you're no longer available to carry their shadows. This is the power of conscious awareness Jung spent his life developing and teaching. Stay away from people who ask for these 5 things because they're not really asking. They're demanding you sacrifice your psychological integrity to maintain their unconscious defenses. And no relationship, no matter how appealing it might seem initially, is worth that price. If you recognize these patterns in your own relationships, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes seeing that others have navigated similar dynamics helps us trust our own perceptions. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's psychology and how understanding the shadow can transform your ability to navigate human relationships consciously. See you in the next dimension.